Suzanne Lemieux, you're joining us from the American Petroleum Institute. The National Trade Association represents America's oil and gas industry. At API, you serve as Director of Operations, Security, and Emergency Response Policy, and your primary responsibilities include cyber and physical security policy, as well as emergency preparedness and response. Your prior experience includes work with technology firms focusing on public safety, as well as serving as a senior analyst at the Department of Energy. Suzanne, drawing on those various experiences, what do you see as the core drivers of our current cybersecurity challenge?
Coming from my background as working for MCI WorldCom back in the early 2000s and seeing the growth of the internet and how things have changed over the last 20 years, the challenge of cybersecurity is kind of inherent in how we built the internet itself. It was built as an experiment. It was built as something that could allow opportunities for people to do new and creative things. And it wasn't thought at that time that it could be used as a weapon against a nation state, a company, an individual, etc. But certainly we've seen that evolve over the years. You know, we've been concerned about loss of personal information, loss of intellectual property. Now we're seeing attacks on critical infrastructure like we saw with Colonial, where you're depriving, critical energy supplies to the public and to the nation. And so how do you evolve to adapt to these threats in a system that really wasn't built to do that? And we're adding and patching and changing our perspective and trying to keep up with criminal actors that are using that innovation that we thought was so great back in the early days and still is really the greatest part about the internet and technology to challenge our operators and even individuals. So there's just a lot of maturity that needs to happen in a world where everything is kind of outpacing our ability to adapt. So we need smart thinkers, we need good public policy, we need innovation, and all of those things will help us meet the challenge of today.
Suzanne, you called out technology and innovation. Can you discuss perhaps the double-edged sword that technology represents, especially for the energy sector?
So for the energy sector and for oil and gas in particular, we really use technology and innovation to drive progress. So we as the US have become the nation's largest producer of oil and gas in the world, and that's largely through technological innovation. And so how can we use those tools and understand how fundamental those tools are to our industry, and then recognize what needs to be done to protect them, whether it's operational technology or information technology. All these systems are increasingly interconnected, and that itself creates vulnerabilities. And so how do you recognize what those vulnerabilities are, and how do you make sure that you have the tools and the services and the people in order to protect them? And that, again, is an evolving issue, and it's something that we're very focused on in this industry. Again, that technology has driven progress. And so we want to harness all that and make sure that we can do it all safely within the bounds of the law and in partnership with our government agencies. This is not something that any individual sector can tackle alone. It's something that we need to use all of our tools to address. And whether that's national security agencies, whether it's Congress and the laws that are used to govern some of these activities, or it's the private sector and the expertise that we can find in some of these service providers that really are the leading experts in the world.
Let's discuss then the private sector and government in greater detail. Firstly, government. What should government do and perhaps not do?
I think what we need to have a better conversation today is about what the threat is and how to appropriately respond. I think what we saw and we see often is there's often a lot of victim shaming. And that is not how we're going to better defend our country or our infrastructure. I think there are some folks out there that if they say, we're going to make an example out of this company that was a victim to ensure that other companies don't have that same vulnerability, I don't think that's the way that we're going to get better cybersecurity maturity across our infrastructure. I think we really need to think about where the threat is coming from, what the appropriate response is from a defensive or a what does retribution look like in order to increase deterrence. That's really what we need to focus on more in my perspective, is deterrence rather than blaming a victim making an example out of them, having prescriptive requirements put in place that in the end is that's not how you build maturity. And so we need to have, companies invest more, but we need to have a better deterrence to what is often criminal actors or nation states that are adversarial for geopolitical reasons that are targeting private companies. And I mean, it's a very complicated environment, but I think we need to kind of get past some of the knee-jerk reactions and focus more on proactive steps we could take to better defend the nation.
Can you elaborate on these nation state-led or sanctioned attacks, especially on critical infrastructure?
Yeah, no, I think this is an extremely relevant topic, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a while. And there's definitely been discussions within the government and within the private sector about, how and when these attacks on critical infrastructure constitute an act of war or something more than just criminal activity. I think certainly the Biden administration, in the response to Colonial and in Biden's comments to Putin, just recently at their summit, has highlighted that these are beyond just criminal activities. When you're starting to affect whether it's, public water, drinking water, as we saw in the attack in Florida, or, energy supply to the East Coast, as we saw at Colonial, these things, it's a new dynamic. We've moved from a post 9/11 world into something different. And we have to, as a nation, collectively work, public and private sector, to understand what the appropriate response should be. Should, a responsible nation state let criminal actors within their borders have a free-for-all in other countries? Certainly, as the U.S., we don't think that's the position we should take. And that's what we've expressed to Russia in light of the dark side attack on Colonial. But I think it's something that we're all still exploring. What is the right level of defense? What is the right level of retaliation? And then, how do you differentiate criminal actors within an adversarial nation state versus the nation state itself? We've seen, attribution can be difficult in cyberspace. Some of these things are at a highly classified level that the private sector is not always, privy to. And so I think it's an ongoing conversation that we need to continue to have, and we need to continue to evolve our position and our response as these threats change. And as, if cyber warfare is the new tactic, we need to have a calculated response to that as a nation, and particularly when it affects critical infrastructure.
Okay, let's get perhaps a little more tactical. What specifically can and should government do to support critical infrastructure?
So I think it's dependent on the sector and the company. Larger companies like our members, integrated oil and gas companies, really have the resources they need. But what the government the role they can play is deterrence. How do we stop these rogue actors from targeting U.S. critical infrastructure? I think for other sectors that are less resourced, for instance, if you take the water sector, which tends to be, municipal governments at the county level, there are tools out there that say, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, can provide, whether it's, threat hunting teams, whether it's tools that can be utilized to mature your cybersecurity program. And some of our smaller members can use these tools as well. So voluntary programs that help you bolster your cybersecurity are very important. Information sharing, timely, relevant, and actionable information is something that our members are always looking for. We have the ISACs, and that's one way to do it. But certainly the federal government has a lot of intelligence that could be helpful if it were brought down to an unclassified level. Again, it's timely, actionable, and relevant. So they can help provide situational awareness to critical infrastructure, whether it's public or private, municipal, et cetera. And so those are some of the tools that we support. We support engagement with those sectors and agencies that have a view into what the threat is and how it can be defended against. So, but again, I think deterrence is a place where the U.S. Government is starting to look at what they can do and how that can help critical infrastructure.
We've talked a lot about needed government action. Can you lay out needed actions by the private sector?
So from the private sector, we really need to continue maturing our programs and to continue investing in cybersecurity. we're, as I said, we're in a new day. We're post 9/11 for a long time, and now we are in a changed environment with changing threats and changing threat actors. So we need to have the situational awareness of that changing environment. We need to have the investments in our cybersecurity capability, and we need to be partnering with our public sector colleagues in the federal, state, and local government, because we are, everything is local in the end.
You also advocate for security risk assessments of IT and OT systems. Can you discuss what you see as their optimal application?
We have in this space a couple of standards. So we have security risk assessment methodology, and then we have site security planning. So you take the assessment, and then you build your plan based on that assessment of what your risks are. So the risk assessment, you do an assessment of what you have, then you do a risk assessment based on, what that structure is, what your systems are, what your potential vulnerabilities are, and you plan against that. You can also do other things like have penetration testing to make sure that when you've done your risk assessment and built your defenses, you need to test them. You can't just assume that what you've done is foolproof. And so there's a lot of different services out there today that our members are utilizing, that a lot of companies are utilizing. There's national labs that do this, that a lot of different sectors are utilizing to really make sure that after you've done those assessments and you've assessed your risk based on your network architecture, that you can test what your defenses are. So it's a multifaceted approach to security. We can't just have, one assessment, one response, and then think that we're safe, because that's just not the world that we're in today.
Suzanne, in summing up the actions by critical infrastructure operators, you call out for the need of tools, people, public-private partnerships, and external services to address the cybersecurity challenge. All these require investment of time, effort, and financial resources. In closing, what do you see as the primary motivators that should encourage these investments, especially in the energy sector?
Yeah, so I think for the energy industry and for our companies in particular, staying in business is why they're in business, and acknowledging the threat and acknowledging the ubiquitous nature of these threats to your business are one incentive, certainly, to make the investments in your cybersecurity posture, whether it's for your IT or your OT systems. I think there are incentives, that the government is looking at. I think there's in the new executive order on supply chain, there's incentives built into that that can drive some of this investment. Whether it's, if you're a utility, maybe cost recovery. If you're a private, Wall Street listed company, it could be different tax breaks that, if you prove investments here, you can get some recovery there. I think there's a lot of different incentives that are possible today. And I think a lot of people are thinking about creative ways to do that. I think it's obviously more easy to recognize in a utility, where you can go to your public utility commission and get cost recovery. For private companies, it's a little bit different. And there are sticks as well. We've seen just recently with TSA's Security Directive #1 for critical cybersecurity incident reporting, that there are penalties for not reporting. Obviously that's nobody's preference, and we all want to be in compliance, but there's some different tools and levers out there that the government has and that the private sector has. There's insurance that is now, cybersecurity insurance is a bigger market today than it was a few years ago. And so there's several different carrots and sticks that are out there that are really driving investment in cybersecurity.